The day before the game, the big girls flown over from. I know where these people came from, and they were coming over. They were from a company. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the name, called Fake Bake. So everyone would be getting their fake tans before the game. Whatever. And we all literally just sat there and thinking, this is just totally unreal. And they were the funniest bunch I've ever met. So you had them in town, the House of Scouts from Jamie's family, and all the WAGs going out in town, and it just got a little bit, I mean, it was a bit over the top. And maybe what happened in that game was a manifestation of the frustration that he felt at not being fully fit. To this day, there's no way that Rooney was in, top match shape for that World Cup. It felt like the end of the Sven Becks era, because they were a double act to a certain extent.
Welcome to Make Football Great Again, the podcast that's not only your definitive 48-nation roadmap to the 2026 World Cup, where is it? There it is, but it's also taking you behind the velvet rope of the world's greatest sporting event. My name's Harry Brent, and today I'm joined by Andy Dunn, who's going to be bringing you the untold stories from the 2006 FIFA World Cup. Andy, pleasure to have you with us. How's it going, mate?
Yeah, all good, thank you.
So Germany 2006, a tournament that felt, maybe from a journalist perspective, less like a World Cup and more like a month-long episode of Footballers' Wives. Namely because the England WAGs, that's wives and girlfriends for the uninitiated, descended on Baden-Baden, where the England team were staying for the entire tournament and basically were running amok. On the pitch, we saw Zinedine Zidane sign off his professional career with sport's most infamous headbutt. We saw a young Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo making their World Cup debuts, and an Italy team embroiled at the time in a domestic match-fixing scandal, summoning somehow the spirit and the grit to go on all the way to lift the trophy, beating France in the final on penalties. As for England, when we think of 2006, generally we think of the golden generation. This was England at their most Hollywood. You had Beckham, Rooney, Gerrard, Lampard, John Terry, Rio Ferdinand, Ashley Cole, Michael Owen, all in the same team. And yet we spent the entire time debating about whether they could actually play together. It was also a month defined by Wayne Rooney's metatarsal injury, his red card against Portugal in the quarterfinal in Gelsenkirchen, and the infamous wink from Cristiano Ronaldo that turned him into public enemy number one in England for months, if not even years after that. The real action, potentially, wasn't actually in the stadiums. It was at the Brenners Park Hotel, where all the WAGs were situated. While the England players were off training and preparing for their games, the WAGs were allegedly, maybe Andy, you can confirm or deny this, running up 5-figure bar tabs, dancing on tables, turning this quiet little German spa town hidden in the mountains into a paparazzi war zone. You were on the front line for this one, as it were. Give us all the gory details. How much chaos did the WAGs actually cause?
Well, I don't know about chaos, but it was surreal at the time. Surreal looking back. Let's set the scene. England media, those who go with there is always an official trip with the England media, because it takes quite some organising, the logistics. You've got to be based close to the England team because you'll see them every day for press conferences, for open training sessions. You've then got to do the same have the same logistical organisation as them. You've got to get to the games where they were. Off the top of my head, so for example, you have to get to Frankfurt, to Cologne, to Gelsenkirchen, to Nuremberg, there and back. You had to basically go with their time so that you could see them. So a lot of people did an official trip, and most of the time, all the main newspapers do the official trip. However, ahead of this trip, about 10 months prior to this trip, we found out that England football team were going to be staying in Baden-Baden. Not entirely sure why. It wasn't overly convenient, for anywhere. Baden-Baden's a beautiful spa town in the Black Forest. Absolutely beautiful. Very well-to-do place. A place where slightly elderly German people tend to go and see out their retirement. It's a spa town, so it's very healthy, quite sleepy. And England were going to stay at the team. So we find this out. So we decide, a few of us decide, well, one guy in particular, a guy called Paul McCarthy actually, decides, who's now retired, who worked for the Sunday People newspaper at the time. He was a born organizer, so he decides he's going to organize this hotel himself. So he picks out one of the nicest hotels in Baden-Baden called Brenner's Park, and essentially books about, I would say in all, there was probably a dozen of us. So the actual official media trip was at a hotel down the road. We were based in Brenner's Park. So the 12 of us rock up there just before England get there. And to our astonishment, and when we walk into the hotel, all the players' wives and families are in there checking in as well. That was to our astonishment. It was to their utter horror. They couldn't believe that these 12 journalists were staying in the same hotel. They were on an official sort of FA package. And I think some of those wives and families and were so uncomfortable with the idea they're going to be sharing this hotel with about a dozen or maybe a few more members of the press. I think probably made suggestions that maybe we should move. But fair play, the manager of Brenner's Park, he'd taken our bookings, so we were going to have to exist side by side. And as you say, it was the first. That was where the WAGS phrase or the WAGS acronym came from. Again, to this day, I'm not entirely sure who came up with the wives and girlfriends acronym, but that's where the place where it started. So we had this situation where, for the first time, it was a thing that there was a big following from the wives and the families and the children. And so we had to basically exist side by side. Those of us who were inside the hotel, the dozen or so of us that were inside the hotel. So we sort of talked in the bite. So there, for example, you named how it was Hollywood squad, all those names for in the actual England playing squad, which was about 3 or 4 miles down the road, quite a remote area up in the hills there where they were actually staying, the actual squad. But obviously that was a Hollywood squad, and it was a Hollywood collection of wives. So you're in a hotel bar, and there's, Abby Clancy was there to start, Victoria Beckham, a very young Colleen Rooney, Frank Lampard's first wife, Ellen Rivers, Cheryl Tweedy, who obviously was Ashley Cole, and then we tended to so early on it was decided. There was a couple of, they were all very, very nice, and the parents were very, very nice, and the parents in particular sort of said, listen, and bear in mind, some of these parents, were seeing journalists who had probably written less than complimentary things about their sons. There's no getting away from that, and so it was awkward from the sense that, oh, hang on a minute, there's Bruce Crouch, what did I? And then you were trying to think what you'd written lately about Peter Crouch. There's George Cole, Joe's dad, and Joe's wife. I think it was his wife. Then Carly was also there. I wonder what I've written about Joe. And in particular, though, we decided that we had to get along. We had to get along. So in particular, Gary and Phil's dad, Neville, he was great, Neville, and he took it upon himself to try and basically be the conduit, the sort of trying to keep the peace between the two parties. But what made it even more bizarre was the fact that by now there's this sort of knot of football reporters inside the hotel in Brennan's Park with the WAGs. On the outside, there's the paparazzi. There's 20 times as many photographers and news reporters outside waiting for the WAGs to emerge to go into Baden-Baden, which wasn't a big town. So every night when, led by, as I say, it might be Cheryl or Ellen Reeves, or led by One of the WAGs, Carly, Joe's wife, would go out into Baden-Baden. They would be photographed. I mean, they would be photographed and then we'd get up for breakfast next morning, and everyone would be downstairs at breakfast. And, they'd be looking to the newspaper. The newspapers would get delivered. The English papers have been specially delivered. And up who's going to be, which WAG is going to be on the front page, So we're looking around. They'd be going out, to be sort of tactical fitness exercises in the hotel grounds, that may have been photographed. And it was just all it was... When people say, was it a distraction for the squad, for example, I'm not sure. But certainly, when they weren't immune to the fact that, weren't oblivious to the fact that a lot of the papers were dominated by the WAGs, because it was the first time you had this phenomenon of an organised collection of very famous partners and families in their own right. And it got more and more bizarre. I mean, for example, it's very topical now. It's the first time I met Brooklyn Beckham, because Brooklyn, sort of like Victoria would bring Brooklyn into the lounge area, sort of late afternoon and have a cup of tea herself or something. And Brooklyn then, who must have been, I don't know, what was he then, 6 years of age, something like that, would be a lovely kid running around, sort of like, and playing pranks on these hard-bitten old reporters at the bar. It was just utterly bizarre. And then you get, the day before the game, the big girls flown over. I know where these people came from, and they were coming over. They were from a company. I don't know if I'm allowed to say the name, called Fake Bake. So everyone would be getting their fake tans before the game. Whatever. And we all literally just sat there and thinking, this is just totally unreal. But listen, what I would say is every single one, and in the end we had we just had a great. And listen, there were times at night when you would argue, they would argue, they would, say, listen, you've been, because you still had to write about, the people they love and they were there to see. And if you were writing something, about them less than complimentary about how they played, they pulled you up on it. And that is absolutely fair enough. And we used to have some great discussions. Some maybe went over the top. In particular, though, also, initially, so Jamie Carragher's dad, a lovely man who I've known for a long time, and a smashing guy called Philly, he was there. But then Philly and his family and Jamie's brothers and nephews and all his family had a B&B just down the road. We used to call it the House of Scouse, and they were the funniest bunch I've ever met. So you had them in town, the House of Scouse from Jamie's family, and all the WAGs going out in town, and it just got a little bit, it was a bit over the top. I remember once, I think Gary Neville has spoken about that whole scene that took over the media, really. And I think maybe it did get a little bit, I wouldn't say annoying, but a distraction for the players. I remember, they couldn't go. There's one particular restaurant that they used it was an Italian restaurant in the centre of Baden-Baden, which, by the way, hadn't quite seen anything like this. As I say, most people there had sort of basically gone to sort of wind down and take advantage of the spa and the healthy air. Occasionally they go down to the horse racing track for a gentleman day out. And the next minute they got these WAGs coming out. And there was this one restaurant that they used to use a lot. And one night I remember there were some pictures of the WAGs and the families, I think, on the tables, dancing with like a fake World Cup and sort of, plenty of drink. And that went on the front page of a couple of newspapers. And I think at that point, maybe the players sort of maybe thought this was a bit ill-advised. But I would absolutely, it was a distraction in the sense that, they looked and thought, well, actually, we could do without this. But I don't think it ever impacted. In fact, famously, Sven, whose partner then was Nancy Delolio, they did organise a very famous barbecue up at their hotel. Now, we weren't clearly invited to that, but word got back about what a great party that had been as well. So World Cup 2006 and Baden-Baden was definitely different. Let's put it that way. Very, very different.
So is this more of a case of just because they were, so talked about in the press and the paparazzis going mad over how, incredible opportunities there were to take photos and all this sort of stuff. Do you think it was slightly overblown by how much, like, as you say, the impact, but just, because so much column inches was kind of taken up on them, did we at home sort of think, it was a bit,
Yeah, I think probably those back home thought it was more of a distraction for the players than we did when we were there in amongst it. I think people would look at that and think, well, how can they concentrate when their wives and families are out in the town, whatever? But obviously, it made no difference at all. I think the difference is that everyone has wives and families at tournaments. Of course you would. Why wouldn't you? Partners at tournaments. Why wouldn't you? Because it's extremely, extremely proud time for those families and for their nearest and their dearest. It's fantastic that they're there. The difference here was that it was just a perfect storm of one. You had a collection. That's a collection. That's the wrong word. But you had people who were in their own right. In Ashley Cole's, white rights, in Victoria Beckham, in all of them, in their own rights, we're actually high-profile, successful individuals. So you had those there, and you had them in an environment that you couldn't basically miss these people. If you go and base yourself in, say, I don't know, during a Japan World Cup and you go to Tokyo, there are famous people here, but Baden-Baden, I'd literally seen, nothing like it. It was very, very photogenic, both in terms of the persons and the place. It was extremely, extremely photogenic. It made for great pictures. It made for great video. It made for good showbiz / sports copy, which of course, the merging of the two, was at that stage, in full swing to a certain extent. But when you were there, there was never any suggestion whatsoever that this was, that any of the players in any way. As I say, I know for a fact that Gary Neville was not enamored with the setup. But I don't think there was no suggestion when I was there at all that any of the players were actively thinking, you know what, I'm really annoyed about this, and my mind is being distracted by what's going on with my families there. I don't think there was any ever of that. It was, it was all good natured, but all rather surreal. Rather surreal, and it was. Again, it was like almost a typical Sven thing, really. He was like, it was the sort of thing that Sven liked to foster. He liked this family atmosphere. He liked the fact that, the families got involved, that they were supported by their partners and by their families. And that was a good thing. That was a good thing. I guess people back home have it different than us when we're there, because I guess people back at home are watching games. England, whoever it may be, against Portugal in the ill-fated quarterfinal, and maybe the camera's panning on all the time into, players' wives and families in the crowd. But that's become commonplace now, hasn't it? That really has become commonplace in all sports. So that in a way was a trendsetter, but it was just it was just a very, very a very interesting scenario.
Yeah, I guess had England been more successful, been playing better than they were in that tournament, which we'll come on to in a bit, I guess the narrative would have been what a masterstroke it's been bringing the WAGS out there. Like, it's clearly having this great effect. Did any of the WAGS or family members in particular give the journalists a particularly hard time? Was there one moment you remember of you or a colleague getting really, getting it in the neck from someone?
No, they didn't know. I remember a very young Colleen, Rooney, absolutely lovely. I mean, and to this day, what a wonderful person she is, Colleen. I mean, I've got nothing but admiration. But she was very young then. I mean, I can't work out how young, but she was. But I remember her particularly sort of pulling a few of us up, on the suggestion that she was just like, some sort of that she was, basically Wayne's, referred to just as Wayne's partner. No, and saying that wasn't the case, and saying that she wasn't some sort of like, just along for the ride, and saying what she was doing in her own right. And it was good. She pulled us up about that, which was good. Victoria wasn't overly chatty, it has to be said. Victoria wasn't. And again, why would you be? I mean, when she goes down for breakfast and there's like a couple of journos who've been sort of out for a bit of the night, sort of stumbling over to the breakfast table. Why should she be chatty? She wasn't overly chatty. But listen, most of them were once we were over the initial couple of days. Of course, the awkward thing was, and I'm sort of probably giving away some trade secrets here, but it's different. We had, we were. I can't remember exactly how many of us there were. Probably a dozen of us inside the hotel. We were all football writers. All football writers, all sports writers. So to a certain extent, we weren't, we were trying to impress upon them, listen, we're here to write about football. We're not here to sort of like, tell tales of what you do in the hotel bar until like 1 a.m, or whether you're having a cheeky cocktail at midday out by the pool, or we were trying to impress upon them that we're not there. We were saying, we're not gonna say, oh, so and so's dad was out until whatever, and it took us a while to sort of for that to get across. But of course, on the flip side of that, what the media, our publications, our newspapers, we're interested in that sort of stuff, of course, and we have people we've got people trying to find that out, and we're on the inside. And I mean, I should probably leave it there on whether or not we leaked any information out, because of course, if we did and we were found to, we would have been kicked out. So it was that strange dynamic where we were like actually being watched by some of our colleagues. So it was, but in the end, after a few days, it got to the stage where I think, I'm not sure we had the trust, but it got to the stage where I think we learned, I think they understood that actually, we were there. Our primary job was to report on the football and to analyse the football, and we became very, very friendly, with a lot of the mums and dads in particular. There, as I say, Neville became a really, really. It was great company on that trip. I say Joe's dad, George, brilliant. Bruce Crouch was fantastic. I say Jamie Carragher's dad, to this day is like, I know Jamie's dad, and he was good fun. So yes, it was. I think in the end they had to. It was clear that we weren't going to leave the hotel. So in the end, they had to live with it.
And just moving on to the football, England never really got going, did they? They won their first 2 games, but unconvincingly, and it just didn't feel like things were clicking. Gerrard and Lampard looked awkward together in the centre of the park. Rooney wasn't fully fit. Owen got injured. Having said that, England kept just about kind of getting over the line and being where they needed to be until coming undone in the quarterfinals against Portugal, losing on penalties, as had become so typical of England at major tournaments. Luis Felipe Scolari cementing himself as England's nemesis, having knocked them out with Brazil in 2002, Portugal 2004, and again here in 2006. But the main talking point from that game was Rooney's red card that he picked up for stamping on Ricardo Carvalho, and Cristiano Ronaldo's role in it, having rushed over to the referee, pressuring him to send Rooney off, despite being obviously Rooney's Man United teammate, and then obviously getting caught winking at the bench, suggesting that it had all been manipulated. In the immediate aftermath of that incident or that game, was there a sense that Ronaldo would be so hated once he got back to England at the start of the new Premier League season that he might even have to leave Man United?
Yeah, and there was initially, and he was, he didn't get a great reception when he got back. I'm not sure. I don't think it was as bad as maybe people thought it was going to be. I do genuinely think it was split. I mean, when we were at the game itself, I mean, the Rooney thing's interesting. I mean, the Rooney thing, let's, the background to the Wayne Rooney thing you have touched upon was, as we had the Beckham injury issue ahead of World Cup 2002 and whether or not his injury would be healed enough, we had the Rooney metatarsal, and that was a bit more serious. I mean, I think that was a bit more serious than the Beckham situation ahead of 2002. The Rooney one ahead of 2006. If you remember, England went out to Germany and Rooney went out, then flew back home, if you remember rightly, to have that injury treated, and then allegedly, of course, when he came back, allegedly he's gone into the camp and said the big man is back, and of course that would turn out to be, well, yes, he was back, but he was going early after that. What happened in the quarter-final? He was never himself. Let's face it, he was never himself, and he was never himself in that game. And maybe what happened in that game was a manifestation of the frustration that he felt at not being fully fit. To this day, there is no way that Rooney was in, top match shape for that World Cup. And I think that was one of the reasons why England didn't do as well as they should have, why they were disappointing. At the time, though, on the Cristiano Ronaldo situation, the wink after first of all, I thought it was incredibly harsh, the sending off. I mean, I really did. I mean, probably nowadays, VAR would probably uphold the decision, I would have thought. I mean, it was a bit of a stamp, wasn't it? I mean, I didn't really think it was that bad. But I think the sort of view from the media out there at the time in Gelsenkirchen was that it was split really on, Ronaldo's, don't forget, it wasn't him who got Rooney sent off, although he did go over to the referee. It was Rooney himself who was culpable. As soft as I thought it was, there was a feeling that it was Rooney who was as culpable as anyone for what happened. So I don't really think it was as vicious anti-Ronaldo as maybe we look back and think it was, or maybe we thought at the time. Because I think also what happened was that what would temper that sort of ill feeling was the fact that actually England, as you've quite rightly said, actually hadn't been very good at the tournament. There isn't. It's funny, when you look back through tournaments and you think, you've done so many tournaments, and you look back and it's amazing when you start talking about tournaments. It comes back to you. Games come back to you. Incidents in games come back to you. But there's very few from that tournament that actually, when you start talking, okay, it was 20 years ago, but even so, you normally remember things. You think back now, oh, what can I remember from that? Oh, maybe it's because the WAGS was such a dominant theme that overshadowed everything. But maybe the football was not great, that's why I didn't. So I remember things like, literally the first game, instantly forgettable. But the game against Trinidad and Tobago, and the one thing I remember now is obviously what would happen nowadays is, presumably if the ref's seen it, Peter Crouch would have been sent off. Not only did he pull the hair of the Trinidad and Tobago defender, but not only did he pull his hair in the act of scoring the goal. And nowadays, obviously, I was at a game not long ago when Michael Keane was pulled off when he just went up and challenged the Wolves centre forward, pulled his hair, and he was sent off. I remember that, but that sort of thing that you remember sort of makes you think actually, that we weren't as we just. Even the game. what was the game? The Ecuador game that got us through to the quarterfinal. Again, I can barely remember anything about that game. I can barely remember anything about the game. We were uninspiring throughout the entire tournament, and it's funny how you think what dominated, was before the tournament, the Rooney situation. During the tournament, the WAGS took centre stage to a certain extent. Obviously, we had the incident again in a forgettable game in Gelsenkirchen, even though it was a World Cup quarter final. I think they didn't play that badly actually, and even with 10 had chances to go and win it. And then after the game, of course, with Beckham stepping down as captain.
Mm. Do you think Rooney should have been left at home ultimately?
No, I don't. I mean, I still think, even when then it was obviously still a 23-man squad, I still think you can afford to take a chance. And that was what they did. They took a chance on him. I don't think he was fully fit. He certainly wasn't fully fit. He certainly wasn't at his best. The team wasn't at its best. But no, I would not have left him on. Because, listen, what were the alternatives, I don't think there was great alternatives. Again, the memory is slightly hazy, but I don't think there was great alternatives up front. I think if you're not going to play Rooney, you'd probably play Peter Crouch. I
suppose the argument might be that, because I probably agree with you, but I guess domestically speaking, I think Darren Bent had a good season heading into that World Cup, as had Jermaine Defoe. With Rooney, the fact that they kind of accepted that he would be injured for the first, game or so, and then wasn't really fully fit. Maybe there's an argument to say,
Yes, that is true. And don't forget, and actually now I say, so we're arguing against myself. We're not arguing against myself, but now I say about you can afford to have someone there, to take a gamble on, who's a left field choice. Obviously, it was a gamble on Rooney's fitness. He wasn't a left field choice. It's an automatic choice if he's fit, but you were gambling on his fitness. The left field choice, of course, utterly bizarre, was Theo Walcott.
Who didn't get a minute.
Who didn't get a minute, and, who spent the time, again, his mother and father, absolutely lovely, absolutely lovely. And his then girlfriend, who became his fiancée and wife. But, you had this scene there where Theo wasn't going to get a minute, and, it was essentially, him and his family were tourists there. They were tourists, and it was just, that you're using that spot. That was in the build-up, by the way, bizarre, because talking about Sven liking to go to nice places, we went, and we all went with them. It was to the Algarve prior to that tournament. And went to a place called Val de Lobo, and they had a training camp there. And again, if I remember rightly, it was, I think it was probably 25, 26 players, and it was going to be cut down to 23. I remember where they cut them down. I remember the restaurant where we sat and did the interviews, and they cut them down. And again, I will have to double check, and people can double check, but I'm pretty certain that Theo Walcott was given a nod. Well, I know he was given a nod. I understand. I know that. But I think Jermaine Defoe was part of that expanded squad, and apparently was on fire at this pre-camp and didn't get in. And that was a strange decision to take Theo. And I guess when you're taking Rooney then, who was completely fit, you could perceive that as being another gamble. But no, there's no way even Rooney, 75%, you take him. But Walcott was one of Sven's stranger moves. That's for sure.
You briefly touched on it a moment ago. Beckham was in floods of tears after the Portugal defeat, and then subsequently announced he'd be stepping down as captain. What was that like? What was the atmosphere like? What did you make of all of that?
It was an emotional day after the day after the Portugal. Obviously, England lost on penalties. I think it was the right time for him to do it. It felt the right time because obviously we knew that Sven was already going. Sven had been I've been caught up in something, off the field that didn't reflect great, and he was going at the end of July. Steve McLaren was taking over. It felt like the end of the Sven Beck's era, because they were, they were a double act to a certain extent, and I don't think, I think Beckham having been. There 2000, 2004, 2006, it just felt like the Sven Beckham axis had run its course. But listen, it's tough with David Beckham because it was tough in that media conference to announce that he was standing aside as England captain. Those of us who dealt with him quite a lot knew how much it meant to him to be England captain, and knew how much he cared, knew how much he was motivated by it, knew how patriotic he was, knew how much it made his family, Ted and Sandra, his mum and dad, extremely proud. We knew all that. From the outside, you could understand, though, that people look at it and look at that press conference, for example, and think like, was he purely for the love of the country, for the love of, representing England, or was there, a brand Beckham element to the whole thing? And that was something that became became more of a perception in the minds of some people, whether or not David Beckham, brand Beckham, the Beckham phenomenon, the Beckham persona had become a little bit too pronounced, a little bit too big for England. It was slightly inseparable. I never ever doubted the sincerity of anything he did for England. Let's get that straight. But we had, for example, I think it was in 2023. I think maybe 2020. Anyway, there was a game in Durban in South Africa, and it was David Beckham and meeting Nelson Mandela, and it became a sort of talking point of, I'm not saying bigger than the team, but it became the sort of the phenomenon that was David Beckham, the brand that was David Beckham, and the England setup was sort of merging. It felt like the right time to end that after 2006. And the bottom line is, no getting away from it. They didn't play good football in 2006 with a very, very good squad. And so from that purely football sense, it was time for a change. And Sven had, best part of 6 years. He'd had 3 major tournaments and essentially, pretty much failed in all of them.
I think I'm right in thinking that meeting with Bex had with Nelson Mandela, I think he handed him as a gift his autobiography, which
yes, and obviously Nelson has a decent one of his own to promote, I guess. Yes, and that one, well, that trip, I mean, yes, that was very interesting. Again, another aspect to that. I mean, it was a friendly, essentially organised by the South African FA by Danny Jordan, and I remember Bex was actually injured ahead of that trip, and actually I think it might have been 2024. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure, but I remember he did make the trip specifically. I mean, I'm not entirely sure he played in the game, but he wasn't fully fit. But yes, they had the trip then to see Nelson Mandela. Some of the players didn't go. And if I remember rightly, Gareth Southgate was one of those players who didn't go. And there was a suggestion at the time that some players maybe thought it was too much of a Beck's photo opportunity. That was never, ever, confirmed. But I know some of the players didn't go to that. But, I have to say that there was never anything to... in all the time that we dealt with David as England captain, I still struggle to, even though I think some people easily could, I struggled to see it as well. It was him using his position and the England setup for anything other than for the betterment of English football, certainly not for commercial, for commercial gain or to further enhance brand Beckham.
Looking back, what was the best thing about Germany 2006 for you?
The best thing about, I have to say, I'm going to repeat myself here, but it was the phenomenon of the WAGS and the social life there in Baden-Baden. Listen, the football for me was largely, and if we come to the worst thing, literally the football was one of those. I've got another one, but the best thing, that was, Baden-Baden was a great place. It was a new thing for us to have this. Bear in mind that those of us who covered a lot of England football, those of us who covered the World Cup in 1998 in France, famously the night in Marseille, those of us who covered England at the European Championships in 2000 in Belgium and Holland, specifically 2 games at Charleroi, a town in Belgium that was basically laid to ruin by bad behaviour off the pitch by whether or not they were supporters, fans, whoever they were. And we had obviously the trouble in France. Those of us who covered those type of tournaments, would go to a tournament at that stage of international football, not just England fans, by the way, fans all over Europe that we knew, you were going with a little bit of trepidation because you knew that things could easily go wrong off the pitch. And what I would say, and I know, I've been joking about Baden-Baden, and it was lovely down there, and it was great, but all over the country, at the games, in Frankfurt, in Cologne, in Nuremberg, even in Gelsenkirchen, which isn't, one of the most, let's say, compelling places in Germany. Even there, there were not any serious issues. There were the odd issues, and it was, so that was the good thing. The good thing was, I think, that we went there, and as I say, Baden-Baden and WAGS aside, we went there and we realised that in the wake of what had happened in that year, there hadn't been too much trouble in Portugal in 2004, but this sort of confirmed that actually we could have major tournaments in Europe that would not be blighted by bad behaviour. And that was the good thing because, as I say, I know you're going to ask me the worst thing, aren't you now?
Yeah.
You are. And the worst thing was, the worst thing was the football. The worst thing was genuinely the football. The football, again, and I'm not just saying this because England were particularly, were so, average. I think the standard overall wasn't particularly good. Again, it wasn't a tournament that stood out for me. Organisation-wise as well wasn't fantastic, which, obviously, again, old cultural and national stereotypes, you expect everything to be ultra efficient, but it wasn't. And strangely enough, and that was also the case quite recently in 2024. But that was the low point. Not the low point, but the worst thing was probably the football wasn't as good as we thought it was going to be, considering the type of players we had on show.
And just lastly, I know it's been talked about to death, but in a sentence, or maybe a couple of sentences, if that's too difficult, why did the golden generation not work?
In a sentence, I essentially think they didn't get on. I essentially think they didn't get on well enough away from the pitch. Not saying they didn't not like each other. I don't think they gelled away from the pitch enough to get on the pitch enough. I don't think the relationships away from the field were as strong as they have been in recent tournaments with England. I don't think they were as strong in that era as they are now. And I genuinely think, it's been spoken about before, that there were cliques little rifts. And I think there's something in that. I just basically don't think they got on well enough as blokes.
Yeah, I think fair enough by the sounds of it. Well, thank you very much, Andy. Really appreciate your time, mate. That's it for our trip back to Germany 2006. Tune in again next time for more untold stories of the FIFA World Cup, as well as for the launch of our gigantic preview for the 2026 World Cup, where we'll be sitting down with a guest representing every single nation heading to the tournament this summer. And our World Cup coverage does not stop there. Head over to Mirror Football on social media, as well as mirror.co.uk/football for all the latest news and analysis heading into the tournament. And give us a subscribe. Make football great again. We are on YouTube, we're on Apple, we're on Spotify, and drop us a comment wherever you can to join the conversation with me, Harry Brent, as well as with Andy Dunn, John Cross, and Jeremy Cross. We'll see you next time. Until then, keep making football great again.